Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. We are back here once again for our WAC luncheon. Today, May 12th. Great presentation today. We're on Facebook, we're here on Zoom, and I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. So let's bring up for the introduction of today's speaker, the president of the Jewish Federation of Reading, Mr. Bill Franklin.
Good afternoon. Arab-Israel relations. Are we talking about the current clashes in Jerusalem, the continuing incendiary balloons and missile fire from Gaza, and Iran's stated mission to destroy Israel? Or are we talking about the result of the recent Abraham Accords, resulting in normalization of relations between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, which as a result means that half the Arab population of the Middle East and North Africa now live in countries with formal diplomatic relations with Israel. Joseph Braude, as founder and president of the Center for Peace Communications, is an expert on the nexus of culture and politics in Arab societies, and an active presence in the region's media and policy debates. He currently is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policies Research Institute and senior advisor to the Al-Mazbar Center for Studies and Research in Dubai. I could take the next half hour citing you the many publications he's been recently published in, but in his most recent book, titled In Reclamation, A Cultural Policy for Arab-Israeli Policies, he documents the opportunities as well as the obstacles and proposes a strategy to accelerate progress on enhancing Arab-Israel relations. Here to teach us is Joseph Braude.
Thanks so much, Bill, and thank you all. Hello to our many friends in Reading, and particularly Andy, as well as yourself, Bill. It's a pleasure to be back with you. It's a harrowing moment to be discussing this issue in any way, as rockets fly over Israel and so much is uncertain, particularly not long after the signing of these remarkable peace accords. UAE, Israel, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, with several more meant to be coming along. And yet here we are again. There's a joke running in Israel today that says, all over the world, people are suffering from Corona, but here, thank God, things are back to normal. The irony is, of course, nice Jewish humor and reflecting a sad reality. We will come back to that reality toward the end of this discussion. But first, I'd like to transport you to the period before the conflagration began, which has seen so many signs of hope, and which my organization, the Center for Peace Communications, had an opportunity to participate in a very active way, in an effort to enhance the cultural and informational conditions across the region that enabled these diplomatic breakthroughs. I don't mean to suggest that we were the driver by any means, but we were one of the active voices that played a significant role, and considerable attention was paid to the work. The process began almost a year before the Abraham Accords, when I published the book which Bill mentioned, Reclamation, with the Washington Institute. It posited, in effect, that a breakthrough was imminent, and that it was not just an opportunity to develop state-to-state relations, but to develop people-to-people relations, and to do so in large part by reforming, in a collaborative way, all of the institutions of cultural change, that it would include media and schools and centers of spiritual and moral authority. That's what we've been doing quietly for quite some time, and making gradual progress. And I think the Abraham Accords showed it was different from the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties. Those were negotiated in back rooms and surprised the world. These were the result of a long-term process of public engagement that gradually primed the populations to accept and embrace these accords. So our contribution as an organization began in November 2019. And what we did was to respond to the growing demand across the Arab world, in every Arab country without exception, for greater civil engagement with Israeli citizens. They saw a need for it for the sake of Arab interests. They believed, and all of this was present on social media, visible to anyone who consumed Twitter in Arabic. They believed that the boycott of Israel was a loss to the Arab world, that Arabs were the boycott's first and only victims. They believed that it denied Arabs the benefits of partnership with Israelis in every sector. It denied Arabs the opportunity to engage both Israelis and Palestinians as bridge builders. And finally, the culture and political technology of the boycott had become a template for feuding Arab factions, whether along sectarian or ethnic divisions, to denigrate and incite against one another, and thereby essentially tear the region apart. And so in effect, the civil wars you're seeing in Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere are a casualty of this culture of boycotting. Not entirely, but in large part. That distillation of what so many voices in the region had been expressing spontaneously is what enabled us to bring together a coalition of leading Arab civic actors from across the Arab world, not just Egypt and Jordan and indeed the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, but also tougher territory, Algeria, Tunisia, Yemen, Sudan, of course, other countries as well, Kuwait, which is still very much off the map for aspiring bridge builders, including a former minister and the nephew of Egyptian President Mohammed Anwar Sadat. They came together and did so publicly. It wasn't like the track 2 meetings that everybody hears about that are reported on in a sort of gentle way, but it was a dramatic, public, symbolic break with the boycott of Israel across the region that happened in full view of the New York Times, which covered it, of Arab media all over the region, and Jewish media. So it was very bold and reflected the bravery of those actors. And they came together under the banner of a nascent movement that we underwrote called the Arab Council for Regional Integration. And that kind of sums up what they all wanted to see. So I want to give you a flavor for what went down at that conference, and I'm going to show you a short video with highlights from what was said. You might want to, well, I'll leave it to you to watch this however you wish.
واحنا وقعنا على اتفاق سلام أكثر من 40 عام. وصحيح السلام بيننا وبين إسرائيل سلام محترم من كلا الطرفين، ولكنه سلام بارد زي ما احنا كلنا عارفين، سلام حكومات أو أجهزة، لكن لم نستطع خلال 40 عام إنه ينتقل إلى الشعوب والمؤسسات.
نحن لا ننكر حق اليهود أن تكون لهم دولة، لأنهم أمة لها ديانتها ولغتها وحضارتها وثقافتها وفنونها وتراثها.
اليوم أنا أتصور أنه السلام البارد ما عاد معروض حتى على الطاولة. ما يجب أن يطالب به قضية تطبيع بحيث أنه يصبح من السهل على الخليجي العربي شركات الطيران وغيرها الذهاب إلى إسرائيل والإسرائيليين يزوروا المنطقة المحيطة فيهم، ونصبح حالة تنهض ولربما يمكن لإسرائيل أن تصبح القاطرة اللي تنهض بالمنطقة.
نحن بحاجة إلى قضايا تنموية واقتصادية. إسرائيل متقدمة في هذا المجال. في مجال التنمية إسرائيل متقدمة علينا وهذا واقع. في مجال التعليم إسرائيل متقدمة علينا وهذا واقع. إسرائيل قريبة مننا، يعني إحنا قادرين بدل ما نبعث عمليات ابتعاث للطلاب لآخر بلاد العالم في أمريكا وفي كندا نقدر نبعثهم لإسرائيل. يعني هم مش هيعملوا له غسيل مخ، مش ناقصهم ناس.
أخذنا 20 إمام فرنسيين وذهبت بهم إلى إسرائيل وفلسطين، استقبلهم الرئيس ريفلين، استقبلوهم في الكنيست، شافوا المجتمع، غيروا أنفسهم. في بنت لا أنساها اسمها ريم من بلجيكا تقول للرئيس الإسرائيلي وهي تبكي: أنا سنتين أعمل حرب عليكم، سنتين ضد بديس كذا، الآن فهمت أن الوضع مش دين مش كراهية، في وضع سياسي لابد يوجد له ظرف.
Sorry, I can't be with you in person today, but I just wanted to express my deep support for the important work that you're doing. A sensible and modern view of the region requires the Arab world and Israel to work together to confront the external challenges and successfully to resolve the internal challenges peacefully and in a way which lasts. So thanks for all your efforts. As I say, I'm sorry I can't be with you. I hope I can be with you at future meetings. Mabruk.
نحن منبهرين بأوراق العمل التي قدمتم. نحن ندعمكم. نحن نريد أن تتنفذ المشاريع التي قدمتم في وقت ليس ببعيد، فبالتالي فخورين بكم. نشكركم على الحضور وشكرا للجميع.
Now that event transpired in London. I've already told you that it got international coverage in the US, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, every major European newspaper, and needless to say, 21 Arab countries and Israel. It really made a splash. It was a kind of constructive shock therapy for the region. Needless to say, it angered many extremist social forces, some states, some movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and so on, which launched a vicious attack on all of the members. We, of course, were anticipating that, and the element of surprise was a factor in our favor. Communications capacities that we developed on social media to defend these people was a factor. And in the end, when several were indeed in serious danger, including in Lebanon and elsewhere, we mobilized the State Department, and Mike Pompeo tweeted the New York Times article and said that people who call for dialogue and peace should not be harmed. And that signal was extremely helpful in keeping all 32 founding members strewn about the region from North Africa to Yemen safe. Next step. One of the items that was discussed at the group, among the group during those 2 days in London, was that we all want to move forward on civil engagement, but we are constrained by the laws of our own countries, the so-called Anti-Normalization Laws, also known as the Law Against Grand Treachery, which make it a crime punishable by prison or death to so much as meet an Israeli citizen. And so for the first time, rather than think about that as a problem that was part of a package of problems that could only be solved through a diplomatic breakthrough, the group decided to look at it as a an area for civic engagement. This was a law, after all. Law, if there's such a thing as the rule of law, some countries in the region claim that they have it, then those laws could be repealed or softened in some kind of a revision. So the next thing the group did was to organize a delegation to France to address the National Assembly, that is the French parliamentary body, and explain the scourge of these anti-normalization laws and call upon Western parliaments on the basis of their own values, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom to write, to have an opinion, freedom to communicate with whoever in the world you want, to enact their own laws that would in some way protect Arab civil peacemakers from retribution. The French Parliament responded very warmly to this initiative, left, right, and center. This is a human right. And a letter was published in Le Point, which is a major journal in France, by 85 French parliamentarians, 3 former prime ministers, 2 former ministers, the mayor of Paris and others, endorsing the Arab Council's vision and calling for this law. And we managed to sneak this in February of 2020, a few weeks before the pandemic shut everything down, including parliaments all over Europe. As the pandemic took hold and made it impossible for us to bring the same group to the US Congress, Elliot Engel had scheduled March 31st hearing in the US Congress, we improvised new ways to move this forward without physical deployment, using the newly normalized technology of Zoom. And through Zoom briefings in Washington that involved Arab Council participation, we managed to persuade 2 brave and brilliant elected representatives, Senator Cory Booker and Senator Rob Portman, to co-sponsor a bill that was explicitly built on the Arab Council's agenda and specifically referenced its key contentions in its delegation to the French Parliament, and called on the Secretary of State. This law would mandate the Secretary of State to report annually on instances of Arab government retribution for civil peacemakers. In other words, elevate the issue to the level of drug trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, and other global scourges which the State Department issues annual reports about. Such a law would adopt the name and shame approach to begin to exact a price on Arab governments that continued in this behavior. And in doing so, it would embolden Arabs like our Arab Council members who simply wanted a similar opportunity to express themselves and were a little bit more timid than our guys, but would emerge if they had this type of protection. And we were able to engineer a kind of a snowball effect that intensified and multiplied the manifestations of young people emerging and cheering the Abraham Accords, which, by the way, were announced and signed just 1 week after Senators Booker and Portman introduced their bill. And 1 week after the Abraham Accords were announced, the government of the UAE took a pioneer move for the first time anywhere in the region and announced that it was in fact rescinding its anti-normalization law. A few months later, the Sudanese government did exactly the same thing. What of the Arab Council? How do you maintain the momentum of a social movement while at the same time struggling to keep safe and healthy and not going anywhere, not even leaving your house amid Zoom? Well, those same communications technologies that we and our Arab Council partners had successfully employed became especially useful under the virus and enabled us to begin to seed humanitarian initiatives in various Arab countries that would serve to embody and spread the Arab Council's message. A backhanded compliment, if you will, to the Muslim Brotherhood, which used social welfare networks and charitable activity as a platform to promulgate its extremist ideology. I'm going to show you one example of the type of activity I'm talking about, which was organized by the Arab Council in a place you might not expect, Yemen, a Yemeni village in Vala, the governorate of Vala, that cooperated with the Arab Council under the banner of the Arab Council, which everybody knows what it stands for in the region, to do a charitable activity, Operation Clothing for Eid, in full view of the public. So I'm going to show it to you now.
الجيش العربي للتكامل الإقليمي مشروع كسوف العيد يواصل تقديم دعمه الإنساني للشعب اليمني بالدولة في إطار برنامجه الإنساني التنموي، ويهدف المجلس إلى نشر الوعي الثقافي ودعم التكامل والتعايش بين دول الإقليم وبكافة مختلف جنسياتهم وعقائدهم وأديانهم، وكما يسعى المجلس من خلال علاقته الدولية للمساهمة في إعادة إعمار اليمن ضمن برنامج إقليمي طموح لتنمية وازدهار دول الإقليم.
ندعو اليمنيون في الداخل والخارج إلى التوحد والتكاتف في إعادة إعمار اليمن، وندعو كذلك دول المنطقة والإقليم إلى مساعدة اليمن في إعادة إعمار ما خلفته الحرب. وفي الأخير نتوجه بالشكر والتقدير للمجلس العربي ونقول لهم عيدكم مبارك وكل عام وأنتم بخير.
نتمنى من المجلس العربي أن يستمر بدعم مثل هذه المبادرات في اليمن، ونحن في أمس الحاجة إلى من ينشر والبسمة في وجوه الأطفال ويدخل السعادة إلى قلوبهم. شكرا للمجلس العربي وعيدكم مبارك وكل عام وأنتم بخير.
Perhaps you're looking at this and thinking, whoops, pardon me, I'm going to turn off. Whoops, there's Arabic television kicking in on YouTube talking about the bombings and the rockets in Israel. We'll leave that aside for now. Maybe you looked at that and thought, so what? I don't know. One little humanitarian operation with a message in one little village in one war-torn country. Well, the rules of the game have changed since the Muslim Brotherhood started launching equivalent operations on a more massive scale so many decades ago. Why? First of all, you can amplify this message massively through social media. We have hundreds of thousands of people who watched that thing and responded in saying, this is a wonderful thing you guys did. And indeed, as the young man said, all countries of the world, of the region, and if not the world, should play a role in rebuilding Yemen after there is a resolution to this war, God willing. All countries of the region means all countries of the region. And we continued to do that and built through the goodwill that you saw a rather massive social media capacity to continue to transmit this message region-wide. I'm going to, needless to say, that the young men you saw there were very brave. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to stand up and do that in the presence of local media. And ultimately, the bravery of our comrades in the region is the true currency and drive of the Arab Council. I'm going to show you another short clip, or rather a piece of it, to give you an idea of what another Arab Council member did, this time quite boldly, in consort with an Israeli citizen in full view of the public. He lives in Tunisia. Tunisia is a country that is currently governed by a man who believes in re-establishing the Anti-Normalization Law, which is temporarily off the books in Tunisia, and calling for life in prison for anybody who meets an Israeli citizen. So this young man, his name is Nouman Ashari. He is a singer, composer, and performer. And using the wonders of modern technology in coordination with our team, created a beautiful song and a music video called Peace Among Neighbors, and sang it together with Ziv Yechezkel, who is an Israeli vocalist of Iraqi origin. The song is all in Arabic, and it was subtitled into Hebrew and English. And I'm going to show you, if you'll bear with me, around 3.5 minutes of that 8-minute song. It's a qasida, which is a traditional Arabic poem set to music. But I really want to give you a flavor of this, because then I'll tell you the story of the fallout. I will pause that because it gives you enough of a sense of what we're talking about. Now, how would you imagine people responded to that? Needless to say, it was a catalyzing event in the Middle East that sparked an uproar all over the region, Al Jazeera, all of the Muslim Brotherhood channels, the Emirati channels, and needless to say, very, very intense activity in Tunisia. The Musicians Union of the UGTT, which is the AFL-CIO of Tunisia, at that a Nobel Prize winner for peace, came together to introduce a blanket boycott on the vocalist who dared to sing that song. And one by one, all of his private clients who would come to his studio to do recordings and so on said, "I'm sorry, I love you, you do great work, I can't work with you anymore. I'll suffer if I do." He was bereft, he has a family. He had to struggle very hard. We were able to line up for him a temporary stipend and a job in Moroccan radio by remote to offset his losses. And we will be bringing him to a European country in about a week and a half, where he will be courting, God willing, new support. The point is, you don't give up the fight. You just keep going on and on and on, because the will is there, the demand is there, and these people are not going to give up, and we're not going to give up assisting them in every way that we can with all our capacities and all our energies. I guess that brings us to this moment, when the Palestinian issue is resurfacing, as it inevitably would, in such a dramatic way. There are so many factors that go into what happened, with, the discourse is saying in many different ways, through many different voices, that there's blame to go around. Say what you will, the Palestinian Authority, Israel itself, the state of relations between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis within the country, which is something that is continuously in need of mending. And last, but certainly not least, probably foremost, is the really evil role of Hamas in stoking this. Hamas, a movement that only a few weeks ago was poised to participate in elections in the Palestinian Authority. And this is what they brought to the territory. Predictably, it's bringing a very bitter discourse back to the region, that discourse where we and others and so many brave people have been working so hard to tweak in a positive direction. It doesn't help any of our friends. And the question of how it will be resolved and when it will be resolved is, of course, a deeply urgent one. It does cut both ways. And I think another thing that is reflected in the Pan-Arab discussion is the role of Hamas in this. And there is controversy and a debate about the merits of engaging Israel, with some for and some against. But there is a lot of sympathy for those who regard Hamas, pure and simple, as a terrorist organization that has been a wrecking ball to the Palestinians first and foremost. And so I think that meanwhile, we're seeing that the new peace accords are holding. The parties are behaving in a responsible way and attempting to do their part as mediators in the dispute. There is every chance, and those who strive for peace need to work for this outcome, that the outcome of this and the bloodshed and the sadness, when the dust eventually settles, will also provide a new opportunity to introduce this Palestinian dimension in a new way, in a new framework that enjoys regional support. That the initial Palestinian rejection of the Abraham Accords was another missed opportunity for the Palestinians, because they can join this process and become a part of it. And many, many Palestinians see that that's the obvious choice. And the question is whether their leadership will greenlight that, or at least not stand in the way. So we, for our part, are going to try to foster that type of dialogue. You know, you got to keep on keeping on. This is a multi-generational tragedy, and the road to a resolution is a generational one as well. But all of what we're doing today surely amounts to no more than continuation of an effort born of ages, rooted ultimately in a remarkable holy book that will endure and will continue. And whatever we manage to pull off in the next few years, to the extent that it survives and thrives, will contribute something to those who come after us that they can build on. And although one might feel cynical or pessimistic in the short term, I have always believed that the long-term outlook is bright, that the arc of justice, or the arc of history, bends toward justice in every part of the world, including this one, and we're going to get there. And that's what I wanted to say. I appreciate your time. Time is low, I know, and I see that questions are coming. So please ask me whatever you want.
Excellent presentation. Thanks for joining us again. I will remind members to start entering your questions into the chat. We do have a couple queued up here. We'll take just a minute to have President of the World Affairs Council leave a few comments here with us all.
Oh, yes, thank you. Let me join in saying also thank you very much, Joseph, for coming back to us and presenting as you have. Just some updates for folks, heads up rather, May 19, it's a week from today, Dr. Charles Kupchen will present on the topic From Trump to Biden, Negotiating Isolationist and Internationalist Traditions in U.S. Statecraft. And we think that's going to be a very interesting presentation. We hope you can join us. June 9, we are celebrating our Dollars for Scholars as a way of sharing with folks in this program about the Alan Miller Scholarship Fund and the scholarships we've been awarding to students who go on to college to major in an international relations related kind of study. We'll be interviewing some of the students who have received these scholarships and also introducing the next 2021 grant awardees. And then June 22, this time on a Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. June 22, Dr. Timothy Medianik will speak on Ukraine, a personal perspective. Dr. Medianik is the dentist at Boulevard Dental Associates here in Kenhorst. He's a native of Ukraine, and he will present his assessment of the current situation in the Ukraine and relate his return trips as a dentist, which have been put off now, but he's been there twice in recent years to perform much needed dental services. And he'll relate very personally about those experiences on a deeply human level. So folks, we urge you to consider those programs and join with us. Mike, I'm a very clumsy inputter on the chat, so I'm going to ask my question, if I might, if you don't mind me doing this. Right. Dr. Braude, with all the work of the Arab Council, I'm curious. Israel is amongst the leaders in the world on the percentage of its population that's gotten the vaccination against the COVID-19. I'm wondering to what degree they've been able to use that diplomatically and extend it, for example, into the Palestinian territory.
That is an excellent question. You've inspired me to look for a very short clip that speaks to that issue. Just bear with me for a moment. The message, I mean, this tragedy and I'm going to say the tragedy of the virus, period, was in some ways an opportunity for bridge building, as you indicated. And very quickly, Israelis, and some of their peace partners, notably the UAE, organized to coordinate efforts, in some cases privately, in some cases publicly, in the name of the health and well-being of all human beings in the Middle East and North Africa. For the Arab Council's part, it did its part by urging people to see the obvious logic of putting differences aside in the name of a disease that could only hurt everyone. So I'll show you how the Arab Council expressed that sentiment in a 1-minute PSA. So my answer to your question is the answer of hundreds of thousands of people who watched that clip and cheered it on social media and said, yes, this is what the region needs to do and do so now. And I think that type of activity wasn't the only one of its kind. There were many other initiatives along those lines going on simultaneously, reinforcing one another, did build the will and the cover, the emotional and social and political cover for Arab countries in Israel to come together in this endeavor. And the results, of course, speak for themselves. You can see a direct correlation between the countries where such cooperation exists and the state of their vaccination efforts, and the countries where there is no such cooperation and the dire straits that those populations are facing.
Thank you.
We do have excellent turnout on the presentation today, so let's get a couple more questions in here. I want to start with, so you opened with kind of a comment about like back to normal, right? So in light of the current escalation, is that really normal? Is there anything special about this particular time, or this is just a continuation of the same thing that's been going on all along?
Well, this is a reemergence of the Palestinian issue. It does reflect the stoking of conflict by Hamas. It does reflect the certain Israeli policies taken not so much by the government in this instance, but by right-wing actors that are pushing the limits of their settlement project, including in Jerusalem. But specifically as well, it reflects the will of a generation of young people not to be sidelined as the region changes. And so a piece of this is not being directed by any terrorist organization or organized social force, but is being driven on social media by young people who say, enough is enough. We're here, we're not going anywhere, we need to show ourselves, and yeah, we need to be violent right now. So that is there. And it does present a serious set of strategic questions for Israel, for the Palestinian Authority, for all of Israel's peace partners. How do you address a spontaneous, unorganized movement of popular will when there's no central address to talk to it? So that is indeed something that makes this a little bit different than what we've seen before.
Had there been a specific catalyzing event at this point, or did it just kind of boil over from this online feeling of discontent?
I'm gonna pause on that question for the moment, because there's so much confusion about the chain of events. And I think it's a little bit premature to draw a responsible narrative or chronology. It'll be an important question to study and understand. But I think that people who weigh in and assert definitively how this happened exactly should continue to, monitor the situation and learn what they can along the way, and just certainly put every effort into addressing the public disorganized manifestation and the organized political actors, and basically have a public diplomatic negotiation in addition to the private negotiations. And I think that once the dust settles, it'll be possible to understand what really happened here, what really went wrong, what all of the stakeholders have in terms of credit and blame, and to figure out how to chart a course forward.
We've got a question coming in. This is related to something that I was kind of thinking about too. As you were talking about the influence of Hamas as being disruptive in the area, it kind of struck me to ask whether there are similarities between Hamas now here in the area and then what we saw with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Afghanistan and Iraq and then Syria, and what we might have learned from that. And then Bill Thomas, one of our members, asks if there are any specific initiatives of the Arab Council to address Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood in the area.
Well, the Hamas is arguably it's in some ways the child of the jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. In other ways, it is part of a long-term development of a social movement, a Muslim Brotherhood chapter in the Palestinian areas with a longer history. A movement that for a period was seen by some Israelis as a potential counterweight to the PLO. Now, on the Afghanistan side, and I'm going to focus on that because that's your question, the progenitors of Al-Qaeda, who include someone named Abdullah Azzam, who's a Palestinian Islamist who received the benefit of support from Saudi Arabia and then deployed, like so many other Afghan Arabs, to the battlefront living in Peshawar. is revered by Hamas leaders as a kind of a grandparent to the movement. There's something called the Abdullah Azzam Brigades of Hamas, and that reflects the sort of family tree. So yes, the jihad in Afghanistan is a an input into the machinery that you see on the ground in the Palestinian areas today.
And have we learned anything from that? Do we have any more effective strategies now that we've been dealing with that very much head on over the past?
Well, what we learned, I think these are lessons that were learned, certainly around September 11th, but smart people saw them earlier than that, which is that there had been a wave of support for religious and religio-political movements in opposition to, or as a counterweight to, radical leftist, communist, socialist, and Islamist, revolutionary pan-Arabist groups from parts of Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. You saw that in President Anwar Sadat supporting the Muslim Brotherhood as a counterweight to his leftist opposition. You saw it in other Arab countries. You saw it in American support for the jihadists in Afghanistan. Some people argue that the so-called Red Afghans, who are also a component of the struggle against Soviet occupation, might have been a better asset to elevate and empower than the Islamists. We'll never know, and of course hindsight is always 20/20. But the point is, you have Israel, Egypt, the United States, and other Arab countries adopting a strategy to address the threat of that time, which in retrospect clearly had damaging side effects. So now the larger trend that we see now is, I think, a wiser one. And it is, to the question of what should the state, what should the establishment in Israel and in many Arab countries now support? Is it another extremist movement to counter? No. It's got to be fostering a culture of tolerance. It's got to be building critical thinking skills in young people, scientific method, scientific reasoning, a revival of knowledge of the Jewish and Christian multi-sectarian mosaic that once was the Middle East, and embracing rule of law principles, that the idea of no private militia should be above the law and have the right to determine its country's foreign policy. So you are seeing, and this is some good news, it happens slowly, it's not a screaming headline, but you are seeing this gradual effort to displace Islamism with a truly constructive social agenda.
That comment about the armed militia feels like it hits a little close to home too.
Yeah.
This is your third visit, I think, with us here at the World Affairs Council. Just about a year ago, very close to a year ago now, you were with us in person over at the Inn at Reading, which we hope to get back to someday. Probably not the Inn at Reading, but someplace. And so we've had a little bit of time since the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Jared Kushner's efforts to kind of push the peace process from our side. Has anything really changed recently?
Well, an enormous amount has clearly changed. The theory that a pan-Arab conflagration would be the result of the designation of Jerusalem or part of Jerusalem as Israel's capital was, I would say, challenged by the outcome of that dramatic step. On the other hand, what we see at this moment is demonstrating that the struggle continues. What we will be watching is the question of to what extent that erupts further into the region. It's still, I think, too early to assess the broader damage of this conflagration.
So if we look at the societal impact, or not impact, but the pressure, the leverage, right? You mentioned that youth discontent online has led to more direct calls for violence. You talked about how the BDS movement had negative consequences on the surrounding Muslim states. And probably we see some similar frustrations around other issues like climate change and global warming, especially amongst youth. How would you suggest these efforts would be better channeled by the people who don't have that state power to try and influence negotiations and policy?
First of all, we're at a remarkable moment where all of the countries that have the most powerful machinery of social inculcation, schools, centers of spiritual authority, and media, all of the major ones are US allies. It was never the case before. So there is an under-tapped or underexploited opportunity for the US government and to some degree Israel to engage these countries in a greater coordinated effort to address the problem internally in each of these countries and regionally in terms of regional messaging. So I've, to the extent that I've been able to follow how far such efforts have gone, I've seen them begin to take off, but they still move along slowly, and it's not clear the extent to which this administration wants to invest so much in that, given its other urgent priorities. Perhaps this conflagration will open a new discussion in Washington about that. But it's not just about states, as your questions seem to indicate. The Arab Council project is a civil initiative. It is a genuine indigenous civil initiative supported by an outside element that is simply giving them the operational tools and capacities that will enable them to express ideas that have been theirs all along. But what that shows is that in addition to the top-down phenomenon of authoritarians coming together with a constructive message and laying it out, you have a bottom-up phenomenon of genuine ferment and pent-up demand for this agenda, and an outside-in phenomenon of groups like ours and many, many much larger groups that have found ways to engage both trends, both the grassroots and the states. And so these three working together have created a sense of momentum. Perhaps that momentum has been to an extent arrested temporarily by the current conflict, but it's there, the tools are all in place, and it's just going to, the machine, if you will, is on silent mode or sleep mode for the moment, but it's only a matter of time before you turn it on again, you recharge the batteries, and you're back to what you were doing.
It feels hard to think about this whole issue because I feel like this conflict has been going on basically for our entire lives. Like you and I are probably pretty close to the same age, right? Like, yeah. So it's hard to distinguish between like, yeah, it's been going on forever, and have any sense of like, so is it getting better, or is it getting worse, or is it just different? Like, how do you think about this?
I think that the big picture is encouraging. I think that the major trends have seen certainly an end to the succession of state-to-state wars, followed by greater coordination among states, between Arab states and Israel, in the management of asymmetrical warfare. Non-state actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies that plague so many Arab countries as well as Israel. So those are two major steps. The Abraham Accords, to some degree, represent a consolidation of that process, putting it over the table when it was always under the table. And the frontier, and this is the rub, and ultimately the acid test of it all, is the people-to-people component. Because ultimately, As long as the will of the population is opposed to what its leaders decide, you have an enormous risk that it can fall apart. There's much that can be done to mitigate that risk, but at the same time, governments can crumble. We've seen a few like that. And when that happens, you don't know what's going to happen next. It can be very messy.
And certainly it's not a switch that gets turned off once we have a peace agreement. Boom, we're done. I mean, we still
Certainly,
have tensions.
that's when the effort begins.
Yeah, right.
That's when the hard work begins. It's not as dramatic. You don't necessarily see it all playing out like rockets flying, but it's really the acid test. And the Abraham Accords are special in that respect because, unlike the Egyptian and Jordanian Accords, with the exception of the very beginning of the Camp David process back in the late 70s, the UAE in particular is driving and emboldening and equipping its own citizens to engage this progress wholeheartedly, and in partnership with Israeli and other elements to drive it into the rejectionist frontier. So this remains, I would say, an opportunity unprecedented in over a century of conflict, an unprecedented opportunity. And everything is ephemeral. The only constant is change. And so the urgency of building on this opportunity cannot be underestimated.
And I think that's where we're going to wrap it up. I promise to have you out of here on time. I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you once again. It's always a pleasure to have you here with the council. I was at your presentation last year. So, you know, maybe once we're back in person again, we'll have the opportunity to do it once more. But thank you for spending the time with us today. And I will let Saul have the final word here.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Saul. Thank you, David. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Bill. And I look forward to seeing all of you again in person. And I wish everybody health and happiness and continued safety.
Well, yes, again, thank you so very, very much. Very kind of you to be with us. We want to thank the Jewish Federation of Reading and Berks County for co-sponsoring for this. Thank you, Bill, for introducing Joseph. Joseph, we have a habit of a practice of sending a small gift of thank you, but we've been sending you maybe the same thing twice now. We'll have to think of something else. But
I will tell you, this is a gift right here, and the reason it's a gift is that giving a presentation, you might have noticed there's no cue cards here, is to me an opportunity to focus my thoughts with the feeling that people are engaging me. And at a moment when it's time always to rethink one's plans and rethink how what the world is throwing at us needs to be, need to rejigger our plans. I appreciate the opportunity to think about it with you, and think through your questions. So that really is, I really mean it. It is a gift, and I thank you for it.
Well, you're a superb communicator. Thank you for also mixing in media. As a lifelong educator, I know the value of that sort of thing. And again, we very much appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Dave Bean and your group for all the work you do to bring programs to us. So have a good day, sir. And I know you have a tight schedule. On to your next matter.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Be well.